So what is NATO's role in today's world? Is it still relevant? To discuss this, I'm joined by former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
So let's go to that question. NATO marking 65 years. It was created in the aftermath of World War II as a defense alliance against what was then the Soviet Union, which had its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. There's no more Soviet Union anymore. There's no more Warsaw Pact anymore. So why NATO?
Right. Well, just because the Soviet Union's gone away doesn't mean that threats to security have gone away. And the purpose of NATO is for countries to band together, to work together cooperatively to protect themselves against external threats. And while that was the Soviet Union back in the day, we have things like Russia invading Ukraine today that some countries are worried about, like the Baltic states. We have cyber attacks, we have energy security. And NATO has gone from playing a role not only of passive defense, but also trying to do crisis management. And remember the war in Bosnia, NATO provided the peacekeeping force to then stop the war in Bosnia. In Kosovo, NATO did the same thing. It stopped the Serbian paramilitaries from attacking Kosovo, put in place a peacekeeping force. And NATO's been in Afghanistan since 2002.
And was involved in Libya as well.
Yeah.
Realistically, let's look at the Ukraine crisis right now. Realistically, what can NATO do?
I think NATO can do a lot. And there are certain things it is going to do, and we'll see this at the summit meeting this week. They're reinforcing their plans for defense of the Baltic states and Poland. This is a measure of reassurance to those governments. That's increased air policing, some ground troop presence, defense planning and exercising, so that NATO's commitment to defense is actually credible. Things that NATO is not going to do, but I think it should do, would be very important to Ukraine. That would be to provide direct intelligence support to the Ukrainian authorities, trainers for the military, advisors for the Ministry of Defense, military equipment. The problem Ukraine has is it has Russian forces operating on its territory, supporting an insurgency and trying to break that away. It's a very difficult tactical problem for the Ukrainian government. How do you control your territory, make sure that it is not being subverted from outside, and yet avoid casualties and firefights to the greatest extent possible? Ukraine's military is weaker than Russia's. It is not as well trained, and I think NATO can provide a lot of assistance to the Ukrainians in that respect.
Right, there's a couple of scenarios which we have there. One is that you could get direct conflict with Russian troops involving NATO. If, say, Ukraine joins NATO, does that automatically mean that NATO is at war with Russia?
Well, let's break it into pieces here. First off, no one's talking about Ukraine joining NATO at this time.
So that's not going to happen, is it?
It's not going to happen this week. Someday it may. In 2008, the Ukrainian government at that time said it wanted to join NATO. NATO said, you have a lot of work to do, so we want to help you reform, but you're not ready yet. And that's as far as it ever went. So that's not a live issue. The live issue is Russia invading Ukraine, and is NATO going to do anything to help Ukraine fight back? And in doing so, the interesting thing is that Vladimir Putin has consistently denied that Russia is directly involved in Ukraine. So this gives Russia a way out. If NATO countries support Ukraine and try to help them regain control of their territory, it does give a way for Russia to climb down.
But isn't the better way for NATO, or in fact the United States, to say, look, let's look for a diplomatic solution here, perhaps autonomy for eastern Ukraine, rather than talk about deploying a rapid response force right on the doorstep of Russia?
Well, I think it's for Ukrainians to decide. It's their country. Right now, they are facing an externally supported invasion. You have Russian troops, artillery, tanks, special forces, all operating inside Ukraine, all supporting this insurgency. You have movement of goods and equipment back and forth across the border. You have mercenaries coming out of Chechnya that are fighting in Ukraine. So that is the fact. That's the situation that Ukraine is facing. They have a right to make their own decisions as a country, what they want to be, where they want to align, and so forth.
Yeah, I guess all countries in the world have legal rights and they can do whatever they want to, but there are geopolitical realities in the world as well, which all countries have to accommodate.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean Russia should have a say-so over its neighboring countries. I mean, how much would you appreciate it, say, in China if Russia says, well, we don't think China should do X or Y? Or the same thing with Thailand and Burma. Should they be telling each other what they can and can't do? I think Russia needs to respect its neighbors and live with that.
Right. On Wednesday, we had a speech made by President Obama in Estonia. Some may say it was a very belligerent speech that he made. Estonia, of course, is a member of NATO. And there are two ways of looking at that speech. The one way is to say the United States president went there to say, we've got your back. If anything happens, we will protect you. The other way of looking at it is to say, this was a little bit juvenile, to go there and engage in what I would call John Wayne School of Diplomacy?
Right. No, and I'd say not at all. What people have seen around the world, and especially in Eastern Europe, is a U.S. that appears to not be directly engaged, to be trying to pull out of military engagements, say Iraq or Afghanistan, unwilling to step up on certain issues. We haven't done anything about Ukraine. We had this reset policy with Russia. Allies in Eastern Europe, despite the treaty commitment we have to defend them, have been very nervous. And so this step by President Obama was very much intended to reassure those allies that indeed we will stand by our commitments.
But if the president is looking at reassuring allies of what the United States is going to do, and according to ABC News, he's carrying a very tough message for Russia at this NATO summit. He's saying to Russia, in effect, don't mess with us. But wasn't this the same president who last week said, I don't have a strategy to deal with ISIS?
Yes, it is. And that's why it was important that he go to Estonia, and why it's important that we deliver that message at NATO, because we don't want that kind of confusion with respect to our European allies. The problem here, though, is this. If the problem that we face today is Russia invading Ukraine, then perhaps NATO ought to be doing something about Russia invading Ukraine. What we're talking about is defense of the Baltic states, a rapid response force, all good things for NATO to be doing to make sure its collective defense commitment is credible, but we're not tackling the immediate problem.
But I'm just wondering, when you say NATO ought to do something about Russia invading Ukraine, I'm just wondering how quickly that escalates to a confrontation with Russia, and who knows, it could escalate to a nuclear conflict. I mean, that was alluded to by a member of the Russian Duma who said, this could be the last war we see.
And nobody wants that.
Right.
And that's why it's important that we bring this to a standstill and that Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine and stand down, go back to a peaceful situation. But as long as NATO and the Ukrainians don't fight back, Russia keeps going. Remember, in February, it was just Crimea. And now they've gone on to the next part, which is eastern Ukraine. Last weekend, President Putin was talking, well, maybe that should be a separate state. So Russia is just going and going and going. And we need to put a stop to that before it keeps going any further.
Right, and there may be an argument made on the Russian side, and there are those who say this, that Russia has reason not to trust the United States and its allies in NATO, for instance, because when the Cold War ended, there was an undertaking, not a written agreement, but there was an undertaking given to Mikhail Gorbachev that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. Yeah. That undertaking was given by James Baker. There's also an agreement called the Founding Documents,
right,
which essentially brought hostilities to an end.
Right.
Does a rapid deployment force violate that?
No. So I'm glad you asked this, because there's a lot of misconceptions about this. The first thing you referred to was the unification of Germany. We had these 2+4 talks, and there was an undertaking in that as Germany unifies, NATO will not put military infrastructure on the territory of Eastern Germany, where the Soviet Union had been. That has been honored, and Germany and NATO have not done that. Separate conversation, several years later, 1997, NATO and Russia signed this Founding Act. And at that time, NATO said, in the current and foreseeable security environment, it's 1997, we do not see a need to assure the defense of our new East European allies by means of permanent stationing of additional numbers of combat troops in Eastern Europe. So when you look at this and then say, what does that mean today? Well, first off, the security environment we are seeing today, with Russia having invaded Georgia 6 years ago, invading Ukraine right now, this was not foreseen in '97. So anything right now is a different environment than what was foreseen then. But in addition, we're not talking about permanent stationing of additional combat forces. NATO's troop levels are way down from the 90s.
Isn't that complicated by Article 5? Whether you have infrastructure there, whether you have troops there, anything like that. I mean, Article 5, which was, of course, written at a time when there was a very clear line drawn. There was us and them. Right. There was an enemy there, and we saw us. NATO saw itself as a defense alliance, but now it's far more complex.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. Article 5 is collective defense. Yeah. If you are attacked, that is viewed as an attack on all the members, and we all have an obligation to respond in some way. I think that is perfectly clear and quite reasonable for countries to want to defend themselves. A different issue is, what is NATO's role in crisis management? When you have something like Bosnia, you have something like Kosovo, you have Russia invading Ukraine, which is not a NATO member. What is NATO's role to uphold peace and stability in Europe? That's where the debate really is. I think that NATO is not doing enough.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, we're going to have to leave it there, sir. Thanks for joining us.